Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Battery Insiders podcast today, live from London. My name is Simon Enke, founder and chair of Battery Associates, and I'm super delighted to have Michael Liebreich with me today, who has a really fascinating background and history. We want to go to many of these topics. He's currently the CEO and principal at Liebreich Associates, where he does a lot of media activities, also including the Cleaning Up podcast, which I can highly recommend to anybody who hasn't heard of it yet. But he's also the managing partner at Eco-Pragma Capital, as well as he's also the co-founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, where he's also still a contributor. That's the word. And Michael, thanks for joining us today.
Simon, it's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Probably many know you for the hydrogen ladder. Many maybe know you from X. You're very like an outspoken person. Probably have many of you come across you there. But yeah, I think there's many fascinating topics we could talk about. And maybe we can just start, because I'm personally also interested, what has changed, or what has been the development since the early days of new energy finance to where we're now?
Well, I mean, it's hard to know how to deal with a question that's so big, so all-encompassing, because, if you go back, I started New Energy Finance in 2004. So we'd been through the whole kind of dot-com boom-bust years, and it was extraordinary time, but I was left very sort of high and dry, and then started to think about what are the mega trends that I could then build a business on and kind of rebuild my career. And a lot of arrows a lot of things pointed me towards energy and the fact that we needed to do clean energy. But it was so primitive. It was such early days. Looking back from now, I was one of the first kind of, I would call it mainstream business people in that space. There were all these kind of, hippies pretending to do business. And then there were some obviously fantastic technologists. There were some policymakers, principally, by the way, in Germany, and some in Brussels, but not that many. And I came along with my, fairly blue chip background, but I was one of the first. But it was, none of these technologies were economically viable. There was all, the kind of the subsidy piece versus the real revenue piece was, enormous. So you'd be talking about, solar power at that time would be 50 euro cents per kilowatt hour. And so the subsidy was everything, because the value of the electricity was 3 cents or 4 cents or something like that. And so, it was just a very, very, very different time. It was just very early. And I was just very lucky because I kind of spotted that would flip and change and that it would become a real industry and scale. And, everything we see today, I would be honest, I don't think anybody saw how big and professional it would get, how fast. I kind of saw it, but I didn't really believe it.
And I think one comment I've heard, right, like about BNEF as well, is like in the early days, the people were like kind of, you're the crazy ones, like they'd be like, you're like so on the edge and you're so optimistic on things. Maybe today people are like, oh, you're the conservative ones now, compared to some others kind of pushing, other kind of stories out there. So any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, let me say that I don't have any executive role at Bloomberg BNEF anymore. I sold it in 2009. I continued to run it until 2014, and then I was sort of exec chair until about chair of the advisory board, it was called, until 2017. So we're now talking fully 7 years. I've not had any executive role. So when you say that we're seen as conservative, I mean, I still have very close relationships with a lot of individuals, and also institutionally, I still write for them. But yeah, in the early days, first of all, remember it was called alternative energy. And one of the first sort of campaigns, because I get on my hobby horse, one of my first hobby horses was, why are we calling it alternative? It's just energy. It's just energy. And of course, by the time you get to about 2015, the majority of all investment going into power generation is going into solar and wind. And by now, it's whatever it is, 80, 90% globally. So why is it alternative? There's nothing alternative about it. But yes, and when I started that business, my friends, my business school friends, thought that I was throwing my career away. I said, well, there wasn't much of it. After the dot-com, kind of wipeout, there wasn't much of a career left. So it didn't feel that risky. But it was way out there. And yeah, I think in terms of the sort of forecasting, I think there is a danger for anybody who kind of, I hate to say it, but, has lots of clients and who's very embedded in an industry, because it's much easier to sort of say outrageous or to say what you really think. And a lot of these there are two sorts of things that might happen in the future. There are continuous things and discontinuous things. So linear and linear and non-linear. And a lot of what we're looking at is saying there's a non-linear thing. Either the prices get to a certain point where a whole new market opens up and then weird stuff happens. It's sort of easy to say. It's very difficult to say when. And when your clients say, well, that's not good enough, I need to know when this thing's going to pop, it's very easy to kind of become more conservative because it's sort of uncomfortable. And an example, and I'll give you the example from the battery world, not the renewables world, talking about what is the learning rate for batteries. And, with the benefit of no modeling and no research, I can tell you that it's around 20%. So for every doubling of volume, you get a 20% reduction in costs, plus or minus a few percent. Oh no, we can't say that because our clients have gone through the bill of goods element by element, and they're chemists and they're materials people, and they know, and they say 14%, and we can't really disagree with it. So, well, I'm just telling you it's 20%. This was, and of course, that was back in 2015 time. And now we start to see that, of course, the learning rate is 20% plus or minus a couple of percent, because there was other innovation. There was stuff happened around finance, stuff happened around, technologies that we didn't think were relevant, like machine learning. And there's sort of unknown, I don't know what you would call it, kind of, I'm not sure if it's the known unknowns or the unknown unknowns, but when you get that much talent and money and pressure and policymaker push and so on, the shocks are to the upside. And so when you're not too closely connected, it's much easier to say, we're going to see this tremendous development. So I was doing a lot of that in the early days. And then I was, even my last few years with Bloomberg NEF, I was having to push the analysts, like, be braver, go out there, say, if you really think that, say it. Don't self-censor just because, some big company comes and bounces on you.
Fascinating. And then, again, I have a technical background, right? So I think, but I definitely can appreciate the importance of finance because, again, without money, things are not working out and not working there. But maybe if you could share a bit more on, what's the difference between traditional financing and green financing? And you might also argue there will be only financing, but if you could maybe share a bit on that.
Yeah, I think that the difference is much less than people think between finance and green finance. In that, at the end of the day, but if it's private money coming in, most of it needs to earn a risk-appropriate return. And, you could say, well, people might compromise a little bit, or there might be a bit more money coming from the multilateral development banks, or there might be a larger involvement from some, national venture capital or national, sort of state sources of funding. But as soon as you get private money, basically what green finance is it's finance. In other words, we need to make a return that's appropriate for the risk, but we'd like you to be green as well. So it's kind of the difficult bit of finance in some ways, to be honest. But it's also very important that there are different sorts of finance. It's not green versus not green is not actually the most important sort of distinction to navigate for the sort of people who might be listening to this. It's actually to really understand financing technological change requires many, many different buckets of finance. Somebody who's working on a new anode material in a university lab and wants to spin it out is looking for really different sorts of finance from somebody who wants to build their third gigafactory or do an IPO on the NASDAQ. And really understanding exactly what is your value proposition, what is the risk, and finding investors that are comfortable sort of managing the risk to the extent you can, but then finding the investors that really understand the risk that's left and not trying to sell the wrong risk to the wrong person. That's a recipe for disaster. You can put any green label you want on something, but if you try and sell, technology risk to a private equity investor or some country risk to an investor who's not comfortable with that country, you're wasting your time. You're wasting everybody's time.
Fascinating. And maybe also kind of a bit of an idea of an importance of investing also in finance in the battery world, right? To kind of understand, maybe with your finance lens, how have you seen the battery ecosystem evolve?
Yeah, so I think first of all, I have a confession to make. I've got about 20 angel investments of various sorts. None of them are battery investments right now. That either suggests that I haven't met the right one yet. I was late to start a family as well. These things happen. But also I'm nervous because battery investing, at least on the technology side, seems pretty specialized to me. In that I'm a decent I was academically a very strong engineer, and I'm a decent engineer. I'm decent at science. I'm a good generalist, but I'm not enough of an electrochemist to know. I know enough to be dangerous, and I'm aware of my weaknesses. And so if somebody comes along and says, well, I got this fantastic new, cathode material or an electrolyte approach or a flow battery, a way of sealing this or doing whatever, I don't trust myself to make the technology calls. And I haven't got a business process around me where I could say, well, that's fine because I can get this professor or that professor. I get somebody else to do due diligence. I kind of need to do my own due diligence. So that's my confession is I may be a very good battery investor because I've avoided losing lots of money. But these things go through life cycles, and you'll see things go, wind, solar. They went from venture type investments, and they go all the way through to kind of till the point where they become much less risky. They become project finance type investments. So I think the battery manufacturing or battery on the technology side, it'll go through the same. And I suppose it's a little bit different. Because there always were some quite big battery companies. I mean, always, by the way, is sort of before I founded NEF. Go back to 1990, 2000, there were already big battery. There were no big solar companies, no real. I mean, there was Vestas, but there was no really big wind companies. That all had to be constructed from scratch. So I think batteries, in a sense, will be interesting because there are the startups, but there are also the big incumbents, and there'll be a bit of a dance between the two, and to see the big companies are quite reassuring because it means that you've got somebody to sell to. If you can build a technology company, that's a nice presence to have in the market. But I suspect they also smother somewhat in terms of the ability for a small company to innovate and assemble capital and have a sort of 5-7 year crack at the whip.
Absolutely, and I think also, in the battery space, you have all kinds of different, right? You mentioned cathodes and electrolytes. Of course, there's also much more engineering-focused companies as well, which don't do anything with chemistries. It's all software. So if you ever have any questions,
I think that's very interesting because you set this segment up by saying, about talking about yourself as a technologist and about the difference between technology and finance. You can't really separate. The boundaries are very, very fluid. So there's no hardware anymore. Every piece of hardware is also software. Because what else is new? Back from in 2004, 5, 6, when I started New Energy Finance, there was no big data. There was no machine learning. There certainly weren't large language models. There was no blockchain. There was lots of pieces that you can really use as kind of force multipliers now. But they're all every component of a battery also has a stream of data: how it was made, how it's performing, how close it might be to failure when it those sorts of, all of that data has to sort of accompany the hardware through the journey. And then you can kind of blend over into, we think of finance as somebody invests and then some years later they sell and they make their money. No, what about insurance and risk management and, batteries as a service or power as a service, or, maybe it might be a battery material as a service where where you lease an expensive material, but at the end of the battery life, you still own. There's all sorts of blending of these different models. So when you talk about battery investing, I think you've got to cast a really wide net over all of the above, and then there'll be plenty of, whether it's software, battery management systems, software optimization, tracking systems. If you have battery as a service, then somebody else can have another business saying, well, where are your batteries? Which vehicle are they in, and where is that? And so on. So there's all sorts of nuances, and in the end, the good news is there'll be this huge ecosystem which will have absorbed trillions, frankly, of dollars that will have all these niches and businesses that you can't today imagine that will, that will be big businesses in 5, 10, 15 years because they find their slot, their ecological niche within that ecosystem of battery. And by the way, it ain't just battery. I mean, you've got battery, then you've got flow battery, then you've got thermal battery. And suddenly it's like, well, hang on a second. No, we don't do thermal. But you do because they interact. And you'll have hybrids and all that sort of. So the industry will be huge with many, many, many ecological niches. Trust me.
I like the saying to that. And I think, as you said, right, it's a very complex field. And I think in an ever-evolving one as well. We spoke a bit about there's also other companies trying different approaches, some of them more successful than others. Are there any kind of, you have been kind of seeing, which you thought maybe there could be an interesting direction to take, and then it could really been converted into a success?
It's very hard. As I say, I'm not the expert on particular battery chemistries, a bit more on business models. But when you've got this kind of Precambrian explosion, that ecosystem is now all kind of self-assembling, and you have relatively low visibility about technological outcomes. Solid state battery, yes or no? And if yes, then which segments will they go into? And aviation, is that really a thing? Will it become a market big enough to actually sustain a supply chain? And there's lots of questions. So what I would suggest is, optionality is, whenever you're building a business, you have an interplay between ruthless focus, which, by the way, I was very good at with NEF, New Energy Finance, before I sold it. We were prepaid subscription information services. That was it. We tried not to do, consulting and get distracted. We did an event, but we did one a year, not get distracted. Ruthless focus, but if things are really fluid, you do need a certain amount of optionality. So if you build a gigafactory, it should be robust to different chemistries, or in fact, even if you have an anode or a cathode or this or that, because you can only control your own, you have a control boundary within which you can operate as a brilliant CEO or whatever, or financier. But if you require lots of other things to go, right, that's very dangerous. If they all have to go right, and if you have options, that's helpful.
Absolutely. Another topic is maybe more on the ESG side.
Yeah.
Ethical, social governance. How does this play into, especially in the green finance world? Because I know a couple of my friends personally in the finance world. It's a big debate about ESGs, and it goes on this way, I feel. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. So, ESG is, I don't want to say I'm sort of old enough now to have seen it come and now I'm seeing it go, but I have seen there is a bit of a cycle, right? In fact, it predates me and it'll survive, but there's definitely a cycle underway. And I think it's important to remember, what was it for? What was it for? What is the job you're trying? Because it's gotten very close to box ticking exercises and methodology arguments about, how do you count scope 3 for this part of the business and whatever. It's fundamentally about two things, I think. One is risk, and the other is fairness. If you look at it through that lens, and in fact, in a way, both of them are related to risk. So the E, it's really about, investors best served by ignoring a whole bunch of environmental issues, either within their own supply chain or within the markets that they sell into and so on. The G, governance. Governance is all about risk. It's all about risk management. And even the S, the social, you can say, well, that's about fairness and see it through, but unfairness is a risk. If you are unfair in your recruiting or in your promotion or in the way that your CEO treats his personal assistant is gross. These are unfairness issues, and they're also about risk. I personally like to go beyond just avoiding risk on those things. I think we should be leaning in and trying to sort of be, go out of our way to be fair. But I think so. There's something, the ESG that in America, some states and some people are pushing back and saying that they're going to sue people who employ ESG. I would just say, do you know what? I don't do ESG. What I do is 360 degrees risk and justice and fairness. That's all I want, and I'm doing it for the good of the business, to build the business as quickly as possible, taking as low risk as possible, whether that's a fund manager or a company. I do think in the battery space, there's a very specific lens. That's my kind of general point about ESG. Don't box tick. If all you're doing is those friends of yours, if they're doing ESG and all they're doing is box ticking, tell them they should resign tomorrow or today, because they're wasting their lives. If they're not really eliminating real risks, they should just go and find a different job, because they're too talented to waste their time. Now, on batteries, a lot of it is around the supply chain, where we are going to be mining a lot more stuff. Well, not as much coal, but a lot more minerals, critical minerals. We are also going to be refining it, and that has to be done in a way that has a social license. And that's everything from how we go about consulting before we open a mine, to how do we process the resulting minerals so that they don't create environmental hazards, to also how do we deal with the nations? How do we respect the nations and the decision making, and give agency to countries who are much less powerful in many cases than US, European countries, Canada, Japan, Korea, or China? You have these small countries that are desperate for their own development, but they very often have very poor, very fragile state apparatus. What is our role as basically the first major consumers of that output? We have a responsibility to also help them in their development and developing their institutions. It is too easy to kind of do a deal, bring back the minerals, process them either in China, where nobody cares about the environmental condition, or they don't care as much as we do, or even if we do it, in the West, but to leave very little of the value add in the countries where those minerals come from. And then you're into the justice question.
No, very much agree on that. Another kind of topic, right? I mean, again, you already mentioned there's a lot of innovation happening in lots of fields. Battery is one. You mentioned learning curves, but also AI, machine learning, all kind of things. Do you have any kind of thoughts on how does this impact as well this clean tech industry, like the synergies potentially between these different technology developments?
Definitely. I've talked about it as an ecosystem, and so I think this is one of the kind of fun things in what I've been doing the last 20 years, that classical economists are completely wrong-footed by all this stuff, because so much of it is sort of co-evolution of technologies that are playing on each other. So you've got Paul Romer and endogenous growth theory sort of gets towards it, and then some of the kind of more evolutionary economics approaches. But if you think that you can kind of answer these questions by doing a supply and demand curve and look at where they cross and say, well, that's how much lithium will be used in batteries, and some kind of static picture, it's absolutely wrong. I've just written a piece, and I did it for my podcast on cleaning up as well, on why I'm optimistic that the trend towards the transition will. I did a piece on how it's going to be harder than we think, which was 5 villains, 5 super villains, or 5 horsemen of the transition. But the 5 superheroes, one of them was, I called it exponential growth, not because it's really exponential, but because these different technologies essentially feed off each other, and they accelerate, and they grow far beyond what the kind of initial market size looks like. Volume drives cost drives volume, you open up a new market, that then drives more volume, you get to a new cost point. But at the same time, other industries, other sectors. So the first superhero of the transition is those trends towards sort of growth cost dynamics. But the second one is the system. The fact that you may be working incredibly hard on batteries, but at the same time somebody else is working on machine learning, or they're working on it might be on heat pumps, or it might be on heat pumps for cars, for instance, which give it more range, make the battery last longer. So it's not a battery, but it acts like a battery extension, and then the cars get into a whole new market because they've got more range. So these kind of synergies, they are again, you can sort of just trust me that they exist, because you don't have time to go and map them all, and it's not predictable always which one is the one that will help. But they are there, and so it's kind of nice being the right side of history where, we've got all these synergies coming together: wind, solar, batteries, interconnections, weather forecasting, satellites, all sorts of things that are happening that are accelerating, the good stuff, which is why I end up at the end of the day being more optimistic than pessimistic.
Which I highly appreciate. I think it's a good way to look at it. And I think if you talk about technologies, again, I mentioned earlier the hydrogen ladder, right? So that's something probably almost everyone has kind of come across at this point, which I highly personally appreciate because it helps me when I get asked. I usually tend to just send this first and be like, let's have a conversation once you read that. Maybe kind of a bit of a backstory there, how this kind of came to be, and kind of, I know you have done a couple of revisions, so maybe what has been the process?
Yeah, so the hydrogen ladder is quite funny because when you in the introduction you said, I'm sure everybody's heard of the hydrogen ladder, or most famous for, or something. I'm not sure the words you used, and it's kind of strange because first of all, it's not my idea. There's it was somebody who worked for the Clean Cities, Adrian Heel, who came up with it, posted a version, and I said, what a fantastic idea, but I disagree, it was very sketchy. There weren't that many categories. There was only 5 or 6 categories. So I then fleshed it out and did my version, and then I got incoming criticism, and I kind of made a choice not to push back on the criticism because I was learning so much, and I thought, I'll kind of crowdsource it. I'll just do more versions. As I learn, I do more versions. We're now on version 5. What it does, for those who may not have seen it, is it's really the inevitability scale for hydrogen, in that it doesn't tell you what order to do things in, but what it does is it says, by the time the kind of transients have all settled down, let's call it 2040, whatever, 2035, 2040. By the time, stupid subsidies have gone away and a few things have scaled, so the experience curve has pushed down the curves and done a few things, what will we actually be doing with clean hydrogen and what will we not be doing? So at the top, the things we will be doing is stuff we use hydrogen for today, fertilizers, petrochemicals, and down at the bottom is the stuff that I call it the row of doom, stuff that it absolutely makes no sense to do with hydrogen. So domestic heating or space heating of any sort, but also a lot of things in competition with batteries. So the mobility use cases, it's extraordinary when you see people who are trying to make a hydrogen scooter and you're like, no, it's a battery scooter. It exists. Hundreds of millions of people drive them. They're really convenient. They're cheap. They're just, why would you make a worse scooter and try and sell it? It's a stupid idea to do a hydrogen scooter. But the same goes for taxis, goes for buses, goes for trains, goes for lots of things. Maybe it's possible there might be some long distance freight that goes to hydrogen, but frankly, it's so small. Once you take out all the freight that's easy to do, you get a small bit that's difficult to do electrically, but then it's really easy to do with biofuels, which you could do it with biogas. You could use compressed biogas today. So why go to a worse, more complicated, more difficult, inefficient, et cetera, solution? And anyway, so I suppose that's what the hydrogen ladder is. I don't know. Is it the inverse of a battery ladder? No, not quite, because hydrogen competes with other things. So, for instance, with natural gas, or for heating, with heat pumps and electrification of heat. So it's not quite the same, but a lot of the use cases are battery. There's another very interesting. Long distance freight is one where there's an open competition where I don't know the answer. Another would be off-road mobile machinery, so forestry trucks or road graders out and building roads across deserts and things. Places where there's no plug. If there's no plug, then there's probably not a good use case for a battery, but there may not be a good use case for hydrogen either. And so those are kind of more open questions.
I think it comes along the saying, right, of electrify everything, and what you can electrify, you might want to use hydrogen for. And then
that's right. I mean, that's a good rule of thumb. Is you can hydrogen, there's this old Heineken ads, which my generation will all know, yours might not, which was Heineken refreshes the parts other beers cannot reach. And hydrogen, will decarbonize the parts that, frankly, no other technology can reach. Because it's so difficult to handle. So just, it's a difficult thing to handle, to produce. It's expensive to produce, expensive to transport, expensive to store, expensive to distribute, expensive to use. So you have to have a really good reason to use it, and its use will be a lot less than the current sort of zeitgeist would suggest.
Brilliant. I know in the podcast we also have quite a few people who are curious about getting involved sometime into the clean tech revolution, right? So I think that also has been part actually of the Battery Insiders podcast in the early days, to really provide a platform for people to get inspiration. Some people are already deep in the industry, some are very new and just enthusiastic about it. Maybe you have quite a career there. You kind of created. Maybe what are some of the things you could, just like share with maybe some of the listeners if they're curious to get involved, either if they're from more maybe like you engineering and then maybe went into more finance or purely finance. What's something you feel that's a good point, a good topic to spend your time on, if you're curious about getting into?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And I haven't seen any kind of good research or good, accounts of how these sectors absorb talent, how people get involved. I do know that it happens, of course, because when I started New Energy Finance, nobody was in the sector, or very few. And I was regarded as this kind of it was an oddity, and my friends from business school thought that I was throwing my career away. Now one of them is my partner in Ecopragma Capital. And, and a lot of people from, Harvard class of 1990, from my section of 90, probably 10 or 15 or even more, are doing things that are broadly related to the net zero transition. So it has absorbed talent. I think, what can I say? Your audience is probably very diverse. Think about what you're good at and find where your skills or your knowledge or your capacities match this, because the industry is going to grow and it's going to absorb people. So you're all welcome, whether it's in batteries or the rest of the transition. There are roles, but do spend 6 months, or a year networking and understanding, because there are, you can also make a misstep and you can waste a year or two. And by the way, on hydrogen, I just feel sorry because a lot of people have sort of dived in. There's all this hype, all this talk, all this policy that, makers, all these huge targets, and people are diving in, and I'm sorry for their careers. I'm genuinely sorry. And some people will spend 10, 15, 20 years and not find a way back out. They won't find the exit. And there will be hydrogen businesses built, don't get me wrong, but they will be far fewer than the current height. I think the battery space feels like it's a safer bet career-wise. I just can't see it going away. But yeah, I think navigate this issue that I mentioned about the big companies and the startups carefully, really knowing, if you're a big company person, go and work for a big company, because startup world is harsh. It's easy to get into and it's hard to survive, and it's very difficult to get out after a few years, because your resume starts to look sort of different. So, just a really good self-knowledge, 6 months to a year of networking. Don't dive into the first thing, but welcome aboard, because it's going to be huge and it's going to be very fulfilling. There's a very good career space, and that's whether you're financing or whether you're a technologist or whether you're a business builder. I mean, the space is going to need all of them. Whether and it could, by the way, you could also be integrating batteries into other sectors or other technologies. The battery space is, as I say, the boundary is huge because it blends across into so many other areas.
I think that's brilliant advice, and also what I've seen now is the Battery MBA, right? This program we run, we have more than 450 people who took it, and you've seen also in the early days we had quite a lot of interest, and still have, from oil and gas people in oil and gas, curious to venture in or even think about how can they use the technologies and decarbonizing the approaches they're doing or moving fully over. So I think there's many kind of avenues now of self-thought and learning. And again, I think unfortunately we have to wrap it up because of time, even though I know we could talk probably for another few hours. But I mean, another great resource is the Clean Up podcast. So I just want to plug it one more time and really encourage also people to come on.
And there's some episodes of that in particular for your audience that might resonate. There's Mark Cutifani, former CEO of Anglo American, talking about the minerals and extraction. Donald Sadoway, inventor of the liquid metal battery, Ambri, not such good news this week, but an extraordinary kind of thinker about electrochemistry. There was Matteo Jaramillo, Form Energy. There's a number of people from the electric vehicle space. So, you know, we've got 160 episodes, and there's a lot for the battery world to enjoy there.
Brilliant. No, I can highly encourage our audience to do that as well. I think, you know, our listeners are big fans of podcasts usually, so I think there's another one, if you haven't seen it yet, to check out. So with this, Michael, I want to really thank you for coming on today. A really true pleasure, and again, fascinating also to follow your journey, and I'm sure we'll stay in touch and we'll see more progression on this as well. Maybe one day you have a battery investment. If you do, please let me know. Just like, I'd be happy to hear. I hope it still happens one day, and I think there are other exciting opportunities.
Very good. Thank you for having me on the podcast. And yes, I'd love to, you know, if you see the one investment I should be making in this space, then absolutely pick up the phone.
For sure. And then, really good. Thank you everyone for joining us for the Battery Insiders podcast. Again, if you're curious to listen to more of them, you can go on YouTube, but also Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to your podcasts. And you can also subscribe actually on batteryinsiders.com so you don't miss any of the new episodes. With this, thank you again for listening, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.